If you've been listening for a while, you know that I am somewhat confused by my people. I live in Miami, and Cubans can go hard right politically in ways that confuse me because I don't understand how you can be a part of the head of the Proud Boys and be a white supremacist while you're being Hispanic. But there's a book here, and it's been written by Paola Ramos, and she's got a number of credentials that aren't. She descends from journalistic royalty, but her father is also, I think, the most famous Hispanic journalist that there is in this country, Jorge Ramos. But she has her own career. She's made documentaries for Vice. She's a contributor on MSNBC and Telemundo. She reports on Latino issues, and she's building her own legacy in Latin media. She's got a book, Defectors: The Rise of the Latino Far Right and What It Means for America. Thank you, Paola, for joining us. You're from Miami, and I found this book an interesting read for a number of reasons because I really don't understand what is happening with Hispanics. So I hope that you can explain it to me because I don't understand how Hispanics can become white supremacists.
I'll try my best. I'll try my best. I grew up in Miami, and you mentioned Enrique Tarrio. And so part of what actually drove me to write this book is precisely what you just laid out, no? How can someone like Enrique Tarrio, who's from Miami, who's a Black Cuban, no, an Afro-Latino, how could someone like him not just be like pro-Trump? No, we can sort of make the case why someone like him would do that, but then take it a step further and become the face and the leader of the Proud Boys. And we can talk about sort of my first impressions of him whenever you want.
Well, I've got a number of different questions, but go ahead and start with him because there seems to be such an overwhelming paranoia here that doesn't even make sense to me. And in your book, which is fantastically reported, you're on the border, basically, with a Latin person who is delighting in keeping other desperate Latin people out of the country by just spending 9 hours in his car tracking and hunting these people who are trying to get to freedom.
Absolutely. So you mentioned, so the person you're mentioning, his name is Anthony Agüero, and very much like someone like Enrique Tarrio and a lot of other folks that I've met, I think they're a reflection, an extremist reflection of what's happening in this country among a small but growing group of Latinos, no? And that is the fact that increasingly more and more Latinos are warming up to the idea of mass deportations and building a wall. And so how do you make sense of that? Well, I think Trumpism is really convinced about this idea that a segment of Latinos right now have become so Americanized, and so assimilated that they too can sort of buy into the nativism and the anti-immigrant rhetoric. And even if you just look at the numbers, Dan, like what you see is that the Latino community of today is so vastly different from like my father's generation, right? You're looking at Latino community where it is third generation Latinos. They're the fastest growing segment among us. You're looking at a community where most of us speak English, where the majority of voters are US born under the age of 50. And so what I found in my reporting is that among that segment, there is a small but growing group of people that even though they feel detached from their immigrant stories, they fear that sort of mainstream America will always see them as these sort of like perpetual foreigners. And even if you look at some of the stats, there's sort of some evidence to understand where people's fear is coming from. Even if you just look at the anti-Latino hate crimes in this country, they have been steadily rising, and they particularly spike when sort of mainstream media is extensively covering things like, there's an invasion at the southern border, or the caravans are coming, or these immigrants son criminales. And so among some people like Enrique Tarrio, or the sort of border vigilante that you just mentioned, not only do they sort of feel the anti-immigrant rhetoric really resonating with them, but they're also driven very aggressively by this push to prove to people like Trump that they too belong in America. And then that turns into forms of extremism.
Talk to me about the Proud Boys existing in Miami, and I want to read a passage from your book to the people after you explain to me what Enrique was doing as the head of the Proud Boys and how proud he must have been when Donald Trump is saying out loud in a way that is unfathomable to me, telling the Proud Boys to stand down and stand by.
Absolutely. So I met Enrique Tarrio in 2018. And so I kind of meet him at a time when he starts to kind of like feel himself and feel his power, but he wasn't there just yet. So my first impression of Enrique Tarrio, who, by the way, like grew up just a couple of minutes from where I did, my first impression was that this is a guy that is deeply insecure, who sort of can hide who he is behind his sort of like macho, tough appeal. He does it really well. But he's someone that, even according to him, he never really knew where he fit in Miami, In his own words, he was always sort of like too black to be considered a Republican. He felt like he was too independent and too radical to be considered a Democrat. He always said this thing that like no one would ever knock on his door to ask for his vote, even among the sort of Miami-Dade Cuban community, which is typically an exile community that looks more like me, light-skinned, sort of privileged Latinos. As a Black Latino, he never really fit into that. And then come the Proud Boys. And the Proud Boys offer someone like Enrique Tarrio not just this sudden sense of belonging, but power. And then you see the way that Enrique, and I saw it like happening in real time, how he suddenly evolves from being this like ordinary, Cubano guy in Miami to then suddenly becoming this guy that is being praised by Donald Trump, praised by Roger Stone, and he takes that power and runs with it. The funny thing, though, the sad thing is that come November 2020, after Enrique Tarrio tries absolutely everything to ensure that Donald Trump wins, and he doesn't win, what's fascinating is the way that the Proud Boys, you have this guy called Kyle Chapman, that they instantly try and distance themselves from Enrique Tarrio and from his blackness and his brownness. One of the things that Kyle Chapman says when Enrique is sort of no longer powerful, he says, you know what? The Proud Boys have always been a group that's based on the white race. And he says, in the white race alone, and any other race has no place in this group. And so that sort of shows you how tenuous that sort of idea of white power is.
One of the things that my mother has said since I was a child as they came from communism is if you want to find out about a person's character, give them power. And the reason she used to say it is because when communism came to Cuba, the neighbors who were given the government power to watch the other neighbors all of a sudden became powerful in the ways that you're describing in this book, and then abused the power of taking some of their identity that was given to them by the government. So let me read this from your interview with Enrique Tarrio. You say, why define women as housewives? You asked him at one point. Why not use another word? And this is something Latin men do all the time. Quote, because it's like the end goal for us. We're big on family. He said, family is a #1 priority for us. He followed up. You need to step up as a man and make sure that you provide for everyone in that household. As a man, that is your job. And then you write, I always got the sense that independent, strong, and outspoken women frightened and intimidated Enrique. I imagine that's why he reserved a special kind of vitriol for them. He would frequently disrupt women's march events with his megaphone. He'd make appearances wearing his signature costume, essentially a full-body outfit that resembled a phallus. He would constantly provoke women, including with the use of transphobic slurs. He called Michelle Obama a tranny and refused to apologize despite the uproar that followed. What's happening there? It's just bravado that's wrapped around as armor, the insecurity?
That's part of it, but imagine, Dan, what it was for me. I'm a lesbian. I'm a queer woman. I'm a Latina. I try and understand the privilege that comes with these platforms that I have. So I understand the power that I have, and I always felt a sense of sort of discomfort that Enrique was feeling among people like me, and people like me are everywhere. We're just people that like understand that we too can sort of change the dynamic in this country. There was always something that sort of made him uncomfortable, but Enrique sort of alludes to what I try and find in this book. And it's the same conversation that I had with other sort of Latinos in Miami, actually, that also participated in the January 6th insurrection. And that is these men that were driven by the anti-immigrant sentiment that we just talked about, by this sort of fixation with going back to a time when these sort of gender norms, and these sort of more patriarchal norms were there. They're fixated by that idea. And then what you just mentioned is when I asked them, well, what was at the heart of what drove you to storm the Capitol that day? One of the main answers was, well, the United States is being taken over by communism. And if someone like Joe Biden won, then that means that this country would turn into communism. And that sort of paranoia, which obviously comes from a real political trauma that a lot of Latinos hold, that just shows you the way that it's been just so injected with mis and disinformation that can truly, truly drive someone to do something as violent as storming the Capitol,
You talked, Paola, in your book about growing up in a Latino bubble, and I'm curious if all this, conversations that we're having, how it sort of impacts the sort of Hispanic community today, and how much we can how rather we can sort of get some more education and just sort of for people who might still be in that little bubble and get them to sort of see a little bit more of a broader view the way you were explaining these things.
Yeah, so just for background, like I was born in Miami. I grew up in Miami, and when I say that I grew up in a bubble, I grew up sort of believing that to be a sort of Latina in Miami, a Cuban American in Miami, meant that we all look like me. No, the sort of idea of Black Cubans was always completely erased, no, from the conversation. I was someone that even coming out, I felt a lot of shame at the beginning. No, I think because I was just so sort of trained to believe that I too had to marry a man, knowing that my Mexican and Cuban family wanted that for me. And so I say this because it took me a while to sort of lean into the person that I am. And I think part of what I try and do in this book is explain, look, the way to understand the sort of shift among some Latinos that are finding something appealing in Trumpism actually has so much less to do with Trump and with MAGA and with politics. And it has so much more to do with all of the super uncomfortable conversations that we just like never have as a community. And by that, I mean, like, what does it mean to have a lot of sort of like racial baggage, from Latin America? And like, how does that manifest in the United States? And like, what does colorism mean? How do we even talk about race among Latinos? Like, we kind of don't really know how to talk about that. By that, I also mean like, what does it mean to really think about the weight of colonialism? I know it's like super abstract and super heavy, but like that really impacted our community for centuries and centuries. Is like, what does it mean to also sort of carry that history? And then the last point that I make is let's also talk about the like political trauma of something like communism. No, communism will always be the sort of antithesis of what it means to be Latino, but that also justifies other forms of extremism that we just never catch because we're so used to just sort of hiding under the banner of being anti-communist. So let's also talk about that. So that's what I'm trying to do.
How much have you explored or explained that Hispanics generally tend to be Democrats, but Cubans tend to be Republican?
Look, that's always been the pattern. No, I think the way that one can explain it is that to be a Cuban American, no, to be a Cuban exile, and I saw it with my own family, like that in and of itself, it means that you're so different from other Latinos. Why? Because even our pathway to citizenship is so much easier than it is for any other demographic. No, the way that Cubans have traditionally been welcomed in this country has always been with a lot more open arms than other Latinos. And so I think that just as a starting point, no, that we can sort of like hide under that protection that America has always given us. I think that explains a lot of things.
How did your dad feel about the book?
He, I mean, look, my dad is someone that no matter what I do, he's always like, "Oh my God, I'm so proud of you." So I don't know how much, like no matter what, he'll always say that, which I'll take. He's my dad. But no, look, I think what's interesting is that my dad is someone that has been doing this Noticiero Univision for, I don't know, like more than I'm 36. I mean, he's been doing it for 38 years. And I think his audience has always truly been a Latino community that was really drawn to immigration, that, you talk to them in Spanish. And that community is so vastly different from what it is now. No, I think the assumptions were always that that community was more perhaps progressive, was more democratic leaning, that had more at stake when it comes to immigration. And so I think he's fascinated, as I am as well, by this idea of like, we have changed so much and we don't even know really how to make sense of that. And who he talks to every day is so different from who I talk to every single day. And I think that's what's like super interesting for us right now.
Do you have a plausible, make sense explanation for how Hispanics can be against immigration?
The only explanation I have is that anti-immigrant sentiment and xenophobia, no one's immune to that. No, just because we're sort of descendants of immigrants and just because we're Latinos, that in no way makes us sort of immune to also having like carrying these anti-immigrant sentiments. No, the sort of fear and what we're hearing from someone like Donald Trump that every single day tries to create this idea that we're invaded, no, that immigrants are bad people, that immigrants are out there eating pets and dogs. Like, I understand why people would be scared if that's what you hear every single day. And so I think our job is to sort of ground people in the facts, get people to understand that even statistically, like immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than US born natives. And so I understand where their fear comes, particularly when you have a Republican candidate that uses that megaphone every single day. And why is he doing that, Dan? Well, that's exactly how he won the 2016 election. He made build the wall his central message, and that's how he won. In 2020, he toned it down, and now here we are in 2024, where he's trying to make that the centerpiece of his campaign because he knows that it works.
What was your initial reaction, immediate visceral reaction to the news that Donald Trump was talking about putting serial numbers on immigrants in something that felt a bit Holocausty?
It was that. It's even surreal that it is surreal that we're in 2024 and we're literally talking about this. Now, and what's even more surreal is the idea that over 50% of Americans could actually fathom. I'm not even talking about being a Republican or a Democrat, but that over 50% of Americans could even fathom bringing this country back to those dark days. And so I think part of the problem is that when we're talking about these things and serial numbers and mass deportations and like immigrants in this way, like it's just become this talking point and we hear it on TV, but people have to be grounded in what this means. What would it mean to deport over 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country? In Donald Trump's own words, like it can turn bloody. And more than anything, Dan, and I think this is important, we're at a point where even Donald Trump doesn't really know where he's drawing the line, right? It used to be that he was just targeting undocumented immigrants. And now what we heard after his comments about Haitian migrants, Haitian immigrants are legal immigrants right now. They are protected under temporary protected status. And so where is he drawing the line? If you're a legal immigrant, would you also be deported? If you are the sort of US born child of immigrant parents, are you also going to be deported? And so I think that's sort of the scary part of all of this.
Tony, Billy, you hear the Miami inner accent? That's a lot of Miami.
I do.
It never
goes. I hear the croquetica, I hear the cafecito, I hear it all.
That's my number one stop when I go to the
Y la
Miami
Canaria,
airport.
right?
Sí.
Let's close out with something lighter here, even though it's not actually funny, but somehow the way that it was said is universally being laughed at by almost everybody.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
I mean, how I don't even know where to begin. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, very good.
LOL. Wow.
That is it.
The name of the book is Defectors, The Rise of the Latino Far Right and What It Means for America. Thank you, Paola.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. Thanks for everything you guys do.